Hey everyone, Claire Van Seth here, and for my lesson, I'm going to talk to you about my summative assessment feedback. Um, so let's get started. My first few years of teaching, whenever I had a summative assessment, I would typically hand back the scores, and if a certain number of students understood the material, we would simply move on and start the next thing. But after reading Marzano's book, I became more mindful about my transition from one unit to the next. So now what I do afterwards is a corrections and feedback form that I ask them to fill out, which allows students to track their progress. Students are able to provide feedback on how the assessment went, which they weren't previously able to do, and it allows for more personalized learning. So what exactly does it look like? Here is an example, just a random example. This is my Module 5 test corrections example. So the first questions, I like to start off positive. What went well from the unit? What concepts or ideas did you understand well? And then what were your personal successes? How did you study? How did you prepare? What are some great things you did during this unit? So again, just starting with that positive feedback from the unit. Then is a section where I ask them to do corrections. So question number, question topic, explain the correct answer, which they need to typically find in their notes. So that's the start of the process. Then comes the chart your progress. So I actually have them graph what their scores are for each of the tests. And for this type of assessment that I'm giving my ELL high schoolers, it's a reading style assessment with multiple choice questions. So they're all similar in form. What I ask students to do is to find their scores on Schoology. That's the platform that we use for student grading. Before I had a one-to-one classroom, what I would do is I would compile students' assessments in a folder, portfolio style folder, where they kept all of their scores and could reflect back on what were they from the previous unit. I like this because I do my scoring by points. So for example, if an assessment is worth 15 points, what would 8 out of 15 points be in a percentage? They actually have to use a calculator and find what the percentage would be and graph it out. Then I ask them, based on the graph, number one, use one sentence to explain the graph, so putting that visual into words, not only seeing the visual but also having to describe it, I feel is really powerful. It also gets at some of those math skills. And then based on how you see your progression, is this helping you move towards your goal, and how do you know? So really having them reflect on the graph that they made. Then I ask them, what is your academic goal for either the trimester or the unit? And for some students, it's to get a B or higher on my next assessment. For some students, it's simply to pass the class, which is absolutely fine. So what is their own personal academic goal? Then number 6, at the beginning of the year, we review test-taking strategies, study strategies. I list some of them here at the top as a reflection piece, and I ask them to create an action step or plan. How are you going to study for your next assessment? And a lot of my students come from oral traditions or auditory learners, and so a lot of students write, will work with my partner, ask my partner questions, things like that. And I found that to be a really successful study tool for my students. Number 7, do you need a retake? I provide 1 retake per student per unit. Of course, there are some parameters and different teachers set different parameters around retakes, but I do allow for retakes in my class. And then number 8, what additional support do you need from the teacher? And typically they're really honest in this portion. Some students say things like, if you see me on my phone, please get on me, or the student really distracts me, I'd like to work with a different student. And they're typically pretty honest in this part, which I appreciate. So going back to the presentation, that's how I end my unit and what it looks like. Again, helps students track their progress, provides student feedback on how the unit went, and provides for more personalized learning. So where did I get this information? I got this from the Marzano-Pickering book, The Highly Engaged Classroom. I highly recommend it. If you haven't read it, they reference 4 questions throughout the book. The 4 questions are, how do I feel and am I interested? If they answer positively to those questions, it means the teacher has the student's attention. But the last 2 questions, is this important and can I do this, means the students are engaged in the lesson. So when I'm focusing on the question, can I do this, I'm really creating that student engagement in my classroom. And what Marzano and Pickering say is, in order to do this, you should allow students to track their academic progress over time, have them monitor their own goals and learning, and to track their progress using a graph, or they give different examples of checklist style self-assessments as well. Allow students to set personalized goals. So this can be, again, for the unit or a general learning goal. Learning goals written down and provide for some strategies to accomplish them. And students examine effort and participation. And again, students are actually really honest in this part. When I ask them how did they study, some students will say, well, I didn't study and that's why I didn't do well. So really finding that the crossroad between effort and participation and the grade that they got, really trying to make that explicit within their learning. And the Marzano and Pickering in this section of the book actually reference Carol Dweck when they talk about teaching for self-efficacy through that personalized feedback. So providing the personalized feedback, I'm helping the students learn about self-efficacy. And I'm also keeping the conversation alive about the growth mindset, which plays into my lesson intentions. So my lesson intentions, this lesson fosters learning by using a growth mindset. It provides an opportunity for the retake, which allows for the not yet. I know at the high school level, scoring a 20% can be difficult to recover from, and I've seen time and time again in classrooms that students aren't provided retakes. They kind of shut down if they get a really bad grade on an assessment, and then they really don't try. Providing a feedback and providing for some sort of point recovery helps keep students engaged. It helps keeps them on track by not having that one score be super detrimental to their overall grade. And then by not actually putting a score on the corrections packet, students actually read my feedback and comments, which I thought was a super interesting suggestion from Dweck. Of course, I do put the score in our online platform again, which is Schoology. And as long as they've completed everything honestly and completely, they get all the points for it. So they do receive formative points for this, but I don't put scores on the actual paper. Marzano and Pickering also state that engagement leads to achievement. So by engaging students in the learning process, we're helping to increase their achievement as well. In addition, allowing for retakes allows for higher scores, which achieves higher grades. It also supports cultural competencies. I learned a lot about cultural competencies from Gloria Ladson-Billings out of the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Go Badgers! She also has some really great podcasts, so if you're looking for something new to listen to while you're at the elliptical at the gym or going for a walk outside, highly recommend her podcasts. And at the end of her chapter on culturally relevant teaching, she states, effective teaching involves in-depth knowledge of both the students and the subject matter. And this just provides another way for me to get to know my students. So by getting to know my students, building those strong relationships with them and their families and their communities, it's going to support cultural competencies. She also states that another cultural competency would be honoring students' real life experiences. So sometimes I do get comments like, well, I wasn't able to study as long as I wanted because my mom and dad had to work late last week and I had to take care of my younger siblings. And then of course I comment on that, I provide feedback. It helps us build that conversation around students' real life experiences. And then she also states that treating students with respect and dignity allows for cultural competency. So even if a student bombed a test, keeping those comments respectful, dignified, that allows for cultural competency as well. And then the last thing I'd like to add is I really honor the students' first languages. Again, in my EL classroom, all of my students speak a different language at home. So sometimes I get feedback in Spanish, which I speak Spanish as well. And providing those first language supports and honoring those first languages and home languages really builds a strong culture in the classroom, and it also supports students' pride in their own culture as well. So we're just going to walk through a couple student samples real quick. This student sample happens to be in English. Both of the samples that I've picked were from students who actually did not do well on the assessment. So this student says she understood Egypt really well. This assessment was about a reading about ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian societies. As you can see, the question portion, the questions that she got wrong on the assessment. Then I asked her to track her progress. Again, the score was pretty low. She knows it's not her best. She set a goal of getting at least a B on the next assessment, which actually is appropriate for this student because she usually does not get very low scores. The strategies that she's going to use for studying for the next unit are taking notes and asking questions and getting herself organized, which I think are great strategies. We set up a date and time for her to retake the assessment. She actually did much better on her retake and was able to get a lot of those points back that she lost on the initial assessment. And then what can I help her do as a teacher just to answer her questions? And I said, absolutely, we can study together anytime. So this is one student example. Another student example I actually have is in Spanish. Again, because I like to honor those home languages and first languages, and I myself am fluent in Spanish. So what the student said was she understood ancient Egypt really well. She says she didn't really practice or study. These are the questions that she got wrong along with the correct answers. I know you can't see the line very well, but she got 50% on her assessment. She says, well, that's not bad. And I said, well, you need at least a 60% to pass. So maybe let's rethink those goals. She says she's going to do more about the activities. Her goal is to get a B on the next assessment, which she actually did. So that's an appropriate goal for her. She says her strategy is to finish her notes before the next assessment, which of course is a good idea to finish taking your notes. Again, we established a date and time that she could retake the assessment, which she did, and she was able to get back a lot of points by doing that. How can I help her? She says, making sure my notes are correct, and I left her a comment that I put an answer key for the notes on Schoology, which again is our online platform. And then she says, thank you as well. So those are my two student samples of the process. And again, this process is really just to transition from one unit to the next. It allows some students to retake it if they need a retake, and it allows for everyone else to move on that understood the concepts really well. On Test Corrections Day, I also give out a packet of vocabulary for the next unit. which again, building vocabulary is really key for English language learners. I just want to say thank you for watching my presentation. I hope you got something useful out of it, and please let me